Like they call it the doghouse.
Okay, this weekend at UFC 290, Dricus Du Plessis was able to TKO Robert Whittaker in the second round and has now put himself at the front of the queue to challenge Israel Adesanya for the UFC middleweight title. And a very good performance from Du Plessis. Did well, took Whittaker down in the first round, caught him open, and then eventually got him out of there in the second round. And you know, before I get into what this video is about, I want to say credit to Du Plessis as a fighter. He did amazing in that. Great performance. He's a very big middleweight. He looks sloppy, Du Plessis. Not many people gave him a chance because of this. He looks a bit wild, but you got to give him respect. You know, he comes in there. He's got heart, and that's one thing you can't question about Du Plessis. He comes in there. He comes in there to fight. He doesn't come in there. You know, some guys kind of come in to survive. He comes in there and gives it his all. And I'll never ever go against a fighter who does all that stuff. So credit to him. And I think he did very well in the fight. It was a good performance for him. And yeah, beating Robert Whittaker like that, Adesanya, you know, first fight knocked him out, but second fight wasn't able to do that to Whittaker. But Du Plessis was. And it shows he's dangerous. I said in my preview, he's got power in his hands. His straight shots are very dangerous. And it's what we saw. I didn't think he would win. I thought Whittaker would take it. But as is MMA, you never know what's going to happen in this sport. But what I want to talk about is what happened afterwards, or more so, what is the narrative going to be in this fight? Because this is going to be a very dark, build-up. I feel almost Khabib McGregor-esque, but maybe not as dark. I hope not as dark, because that went too far. As much as that was a great fight and a big fight between two great legends of the sport, it didn't need to go as far as it was. It was big on its own, and I like the heat between fights. I like the DC and Jones. I like, the Covington Masvidal. I like the Usman and Covington. You know, I like Dillashaw Garbrandt, you know, Silver and Sonnen to an extent. You know, I could go on. There's so many big fights in the UFC and MMA which have always had that real bad blood between them. But there's a point where it goes too far, and that's where I don't want it to go. But I think it is going to go there. So, but the main thing I want to talk about. So Adesanya, after the fight, when Du Plessis won, he was doing an interview with Joe Rogan. Adesanya came into the octagon and started blasting N-words or M-bombs, and really it was an awkward one because it was like, it just felt really weird to watch. You know, it was uncomfortable. I feel like even Du Plessis didn't know what to really do, and his trash talk wasn't like anything amazing. People say Adesanya looked like a fool. I think Adesanya was drunk for one, so I think that's why he was sort of stumbling and going all over, or not stumbling, but sort of I don't know, just going on and on. I do think, though, alcohol does two things. It can bring out the worst version in a person, and one thing it can do is reveal that person's true emotions. And his first word he actually said to Du Plessis was, "This is my African brother." Now, there is a narrative that is leading up to this fight, and this is why I say I don't like it, but it's going to go there. So there's obviously a narrative. Dricus Du Plessis, a while back, did an interview or a press conference in which he talked about how he was going to be the first African fighter to bring the belt back to Africa, and he's the African fighter in the UFC. I'm going to play the video in a minute, but he basically ran with this narrative, and because of this said narrative, Kamaru Usman was critical of him. He made a line, I'm paraphrasing, about just because you're from China or because you moved to China doesn't make you more Chinese than someone from China. Something along them lines. And Adesanya really took offense to this and started calling him a lot of stuff. And I don't really like this narrative, but if we're going to go along with it, I believe that people are being way too ignorant in this narrative. And I actually think, right, I'm not siding with anybody here, right, but I always like to look at situations and look at both sides. For whatever reason, the MMA community have decided that Adesanya is in the wrong here, that Du Plessis said nothing wrong. So I'm going to play the video now of what Du Plessis said and why Adesanya is so enraged by what was said by Du Plessis.
Changed. is it a little bum? Does it bum you out? There's not as much gold potentially going back the next time they go, or do you see this as an opportunity? Now you do get to be the guy if and when they show up to Africa.
Well, I mean, did those belts ever go to Africa? As far as I know, it came to America and New Zealand. I'm going to take a belt to Africa. I'm the African fighter in the UFC. Myself and Cameron, we breathe the African air. We wake up in Africa every day. We train in Africa. We're African born. We're African raised. We still reside in Africa. We train out of Africa. That's an African champion, and that's who I'll be.
Obviously, this time.
Okay, so as you heard there, Du Plessis said it himself. I am the African fighter in the UFC. He's going to take the belt back. They breathe African air. And all of this sort of talk. And I don't know, maybe he was trying to sell the fight with Adesanya. It may be the case. But for whatever reason, people are being very ignorant towards this and almost acting like Du Plessis literally did nothing wrong. Like, he said something that was perfectly reasonable. And Adesanya, like always, is being over emotional and dramatic about this. And he's not being very fair or whatever. I don't know. But I'm here to say this, right? Again, this is where I say something, and I feel people might take this the wrong way, but I almost feel like you need to be from a certain background to kind of understand Adesanya's anger here. So, Du Plessis is born in South Africa, trains out of Africa. So there's two, some people are born in certain countries but move to the other, such as Adesanya and Usman, and Ngannou as well, to be fair to him. And there's a lot of fighters who have this. There's a lot of fighters, not just fighters. There's people from everywhere who, it's part of the world. People go born in one country, but they don't stay there forever. They move. And I believe that, from my own point of view, I'm born in Manchester, but in the UK, but I come from a Pakistani and Indian background. This here, I believe, kind of puts me in a place where I can understand slightly what Adesanya is angry about. Because with Adesanya, he's very... To say, I think this is going to be the darkest build-up. He's had a lot of beef, Adesanya, right? He did not like Costa. He didn't like Pereira. Well, Pereira, in fairness, there was more mutual respect. But there was a little bit of a deep line thing with Pereira. Who was another one? Vittori. He didn't really like Vittori. That was just classic fighter beef, though. There was nothing really that deep into it. John Jones, they obviously went back and forth, but now they're cool. But he's annoyed, Adesanya, and the reason he's annoyed, Adesanya is born in Nigeria. And why people do this, I don't know. They also do this with Usman. Everybody seems, when it comes to Kamaru Usman, trying to sort of claim his Nigerian background. People like to point out that he lives in Nebraska or moved to Nebraska, and that's where he's from. I don't know if people are just choosing to be stupid or just want to kind of just be a troll. If you're born in a country, you are from that country. You are that, your heritage may be of different sort of things, but your mother or dad may be from a different type of country, or their family may be from a different country, but ultimately you're born in the country. That's who you are. Adesanya and Usman are Nigerian, but for whatever reason, Du Plessis obviously came out and said that he's going to be the African fighter in the UFC. If you are Usman and Adesanya, and I'll go specifically with Adesanya because he's the one fighting him. You hear a guy who's also African coming out and saying that he's going to be the African fighter in the UFC, and he constantly kept talking about, I want to be the African fighter, I'm going to fight out of Africa, I breathe African air. He kept talking about Africa. He is emphasizing this very, very strongly. Now, this is where it gets very awkward, because Adesanya's anger, like I said, it comes from the fact that you got a guy in Du Plessis, and it's awkward to talk about this, but people, I'm not no historian, right? This is not a historian channel. People, I'm sure, or most, are aware of the colonization that took place in Africa during the sort of 1800s, where European countries would come to Africa for the sort of materials, the raw materials that would go on there. And as a result, many people died in this, and it also opened up some trade routes from the slave trade that took on, from the slaves that kind of travelled from Africa to America. and not a lot of them made it. Now, this is not a history channel. I'm not going to act like I'm so educated on this, but I have a basic knowledge of this, right? Africa is essentially, I'll put it bluntly because the only way I can put it is a black country. Adesanya and Usman and Ngannou, are examples of this. Ngannou is from Cameroon, Usman and Adesanya are from Nigeria. If they went up to you and told you where they were from, you would believe them. Ultimately, that's what Africa was. And when the colonization happened, there's a lot of different things that took place. And Adesanya came up with a line about the ancestry thing that you can take, where basically it tells you where you're from and it tracks your roots all the way back. Adesanya said his roots are in Nigeria. When you go back, it will go to Nigeria because that's where his parents are from. That's where it tracks back to. With Du Plessis, if you were to track his roots back all the way, you would find that I'm not saying I don't know where he's from or whatever, right? But I think everybody kind of knows it would not track all the way back to South Africa. I'm not going to say 100%, but it just the colonization is a big thing, and for somebody who is sort of from that kind of background to tell another person who you track it back is African, right? Because he moved to New Zealand, and I don't understand this, because he moved to New Zealand when he was a kid, so he didn't really have a say in the matter. It's not as if Adesanya chose to actively, live in Nigeria, and then he went to New Zealand and decided to stay there, and he's claiming it. Ultimately, he's from Africa, right? And, again, Du Plessis did not explicitly say Adesanya, Usman, and Ngannou are not African. He said, actually, they are African, but I was saying whatever. What Du Plessis said, though, was, and like I said, the line that I think is the one where, in my opinion, I think he went a bit, I'm not going to say he's in the wrong, I don't want to take sides, but I just feel he went a bit far, was the one of, I'm the African fighter in the UFC. And yet, people are choosing to be very ignorant and be sort of talk about how the fact that, he was just talking about how he was, he is the African fighter in the UFC. He's, from Africa. He trains in Africa, all this kind of stuff. People, I bet you use your brain. What do you think he's insinuating by saying, I am the African fighter in the UFC? He said those belts. He explicitly even said those belts never went to Africa. What is the need to bring that up in the conversation? Again, Adesanya is a petty guy. I get it. That's why some people don't like him. I don't hate him or like him. I like him as a fighter. Personality-wise, I don't know him, so I can't comment. But I can understand his anger. Like Adesanya said, I think it was in his podcast or his brother's show, whatever it was. He said he never once talked about Du Plessis. He never cussed him. Never talked about his real heritage or talking about how he's not real African. And Adesanya says it. Who is he to talk about that kind of stuff when if you track his roots all the way back, it won't be in Africa. Adesanya did not say anything to... For once, he actually didn't even initiate the trash talk. It was Du Plessis. And now, for something that Du Plessis said, which I felt was so careless and so needless, and they're selling a fight, but then they're selling it to the point where I feel like it's going to get nasty. And it doesn't need to be. And it didn't need to be nasty. They could have promoted this, right, to my knowledge anyway. This is the first time two African fighters are going to fight for a title. I might be wrong, my memory goes, but pretty sure it is. Obviously, Ngannou, Usman and Adesanya were the first sort of African champions in the UFC. That could have been so great, but because I think Du Plessis said this, it sort of painted a very twisted narrative around this fight, and because of what Du Plessis said, I can understand Adesanya's anger. I really can. If somebody, if I'm hypothetically here, if I'm not on YouTube and I'm a UFC fighter, and somebody says I'm going to be the real South Asian fighter in the UFC, I'm going to take it back. And even then, I'm not even born in India or Pakistan. Adesanya is actually born in Nigeria. So it gives a completely different thing. But if somebody said that about me, I'd be annoyed too. Would you not be annoyed? Du Plessis, he's not openly questioning Adesanya's ethnicity to a point, or nationality. But if you read between the lines, you got to understand what some people are saying. And again, it's so easy to see why Adesanya would be annoyed. Why, like he said, he really wants this fight. Why he looked so annoyed Octagon side. Again, people try and act like, oh, Du Plessis did nothing wrong. They almost try to act he's ignorant. And they try to act like he was just perfect. What he said was perfectly fine. Like I said, if you're from a certain background, you got to understand why Adesanya is angry. It's not because he's being petty or because he's just built that way. It's because Du Plessis, in his mind, sort of with a slight tone of, he basically insinuated, there's a sort of indiscretion about, he insinuated that Adesanya isn't really African because he never really doesn't train out of Africa. I'm not saying that is what Du Plessis said. I'm saying that is the way Adesanya views it. And that is ultimately where I think his anger comes from, you know. You could go back to colonization, all the crazy stuff that happened there, and that is where Adesanya's now had to sort of lash out, and it's building a very ugly narrative for this fight. But what I don't understand is people acting so almost just clueless to why he would be annoyed. Adesanya is not being unreasonable. Adesanya, I felt, was for no reason really, or not no reason, but against Robert Whittaker the first time they fought, he was kind of going at him for little things because Whittaker posted a meme and stuff like that. He went at Costa because those two went back and forth, but it wasn't something crazy. But with Du Plessis, it's the first time where I genuinely can understand why he's annoyed at this, why he has that sort of chip on his shoulder, why, you know, as a man who's born in Nigeria, why you'd be annoyed when a man is coming out and saying that he's the real African and he's going to be the one to take the belt back to Africa, which is wrong anyway, because Ngannou took the belt back to his village, and so did Adesanya. There's a video on his YouTube channel, one of the studio things that he works with him going back to Nigeria and giving like the kids, I think in his old school, his belt and stuff like that. So again, I don't understand why Du Plessis chose these words. I understand selling the fight, but this is not the way to do it, I don't think, at all. I try not to be biased with any fighter, but or any. I try to keep it, you know, neutral. But I can't just ignore this. The reason I'm saying all this is because people are acting as if Adesanya is being very unreasonable. He isn't. He is being, I won't say reasonable, but his anger, I feel, to a certain extent, is justified. I can understand why Adesanya is angry at Du Plessis, because for somebody who is born there, for someone to essentially almost illegitimately question it, why would you not be annoyed? Ultimately, I feel as humans, people don't like being... There's certain things you can almost tease or talk about with a person, but I think a lot of people do take a lot of pride where they're from, especially fighters. How many times you've seen fighters, you know, they obviously have banned the flags now, but how many times would you see fighters come out and almost come out with the flags and, you know, always talk about how representing Du Plessis, he always talks about he's big doing it for South Africa, which I think is good, but fighters are very proud because it's almost as if you're representing your nation when you're going out there and fighting for them, and that is a very, very it's a very deep-rooted thing, and when you question that, it's going to really get somebody's back up. And again, people are talking about, oh, Du Plessis did nothing wrong. I've even seen some people who are Africans themselves talking about how it's fine what he said. Again, try and put yourself in the other person's shoes. I am not saying that I am with Adesanya or Du Plessis, but what I'm saying is I can understand. I understand Du Plessis. He obviously was just talking about how I think he got lost in his patriotism for Africa and for South Africa and wanted to kind of just blurt it out how much he loves it and how he's going to be the one to take the belt back, and he was so pumped, but I don't think he realised, you know, you could have said, right, and he can say what he wants, but he could have said, listen, respect to Usman, Adesanya and Ngannou, they did their thing, they won those belts, they did great for Africa, but I want to be the one, you know, who comes out, who fights out of Africa to take it back. I think that would be great. Like what Edwards did. Leon Edwards came out when Michael Bisping and when he won the belt and he was talking about Michael Bisping, he's like, it's great to be the first UK fighter to do it. Obviously, Bisping did it, but he did it more in America. I want to show that I could do it out of the UK. What Edwards says and what Du Plessis said are two different things, because Edwards isn't going at Bisping or isn't indirectly, and the fight is going to be interesting, but I'll be honest, I don't think I felt the line was unnecessary. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Du Plessis is a racist or anything, far from it, but I just feel I understand why I would be annoyed if I was Adesanya, and he said that same stuff about me. He was talking about how the belts went to America and New Zealand, which, yes, fighting-wise, it's true, because that's where they train out of, but they still... I don't know about Usman. I'd imagine he would have, but I know Adesanya did take the belt when he won against Gastelum back to Nigeria. Or it might have been Whitaker. I can't remember. One of the two, he took the belt back, I remember. And... even there's actually a clip on Joe Rogan's podcast when Adesanya talked about going back to Nigeria. So I don't understand this whole thing of people move all the time. It's not an issue. Just because Adesanya decided to move, or didn't decide to move, just because his family decided to move from Nigeria, doesn't make him any less African or Nigerian. And again, Du Plessis' words insinuated that. Whether you want to ignore it or maybe people disagree with it, that's cool. But ultimately, I'm saying I get Adesanya's anger and his frustration towards this. And yeah, I don't know. People, they're so ignorant towards this. They are like, Adesanya is completely in the wrong here. He's just doing what he always does, going crazy. Just think, man. Adesanya, don't get wrong, he has tendencies. He does. I think he performs better when he has an issue with someone. So I think that is. I think that's something that people kind of play on, and I think might not shape up well for Du Plessis if that is the case, because Adesanya, like he was against Costa, if he does that to Du Plessis, it's just a long night. But I don't personally, I don't know why people are acting so ignorant towards this. It's very, very clear why he is annoyed, and yeah, I just think, like I said, he has got tendencies, Adesanya, but I genuinely think in my heart, I don't think this is one of the times where I feel he's being unreasonable or being annoyed or triggered for no reason. And you could say maybe it's like some people that say it's, he's not comfortable with himself. That's, why does he care? Somebody's saying this about him. But ultimately, he's a fighter. And while some people can just sort of let things go in one ear out the other, some people take words to heart. And when it's something as deep as that, there's a lot that goes with it. And yeah, like I said, I don't think Du Plessis was trying to question that, but he inexplicably did. He did that, and I just think that it's going to be an interesting one, this fight. It's going to take an ugly turn. I go with Adesanya for the fight as a fighter. In general, I don't think people will say Du Plessis because of what it's a Whitaker, but I think there's levels in the striking that are different. But yeah, I think it's going to be a very interesting build-up though, and it's a fun one, but I just think it's going to take a dark turn. But all my point with this whole video is, I kind of went on, but my point, what I'm trying to get at here is, I understand why Adesanya is angry, and this is why he is angry. As a human, we ain't got no right to talk about where somebody's from and where he's not from, and how they're more something than somebody else. In Adesanya's mind, he never questioned Du Plessis, being African, but Du Plessis did exactly that in Adesanya's mind. Whether you agree with Adesanya or you feel like he was overreacting, regardless, you have to understand that's where the anger comes from. And when you really break down Du Plessis' words, I can see why he would feel that way. And honestly, when Du Plessis first said it, I thought the same thing. I felt it was not necessary to say those type of things. And it's now led to a weird build-up, and it's going to be a dark one. But this is the fight game, and this is not a nice business. People get hurt inside and outside the octagon with the words and with the fists. So, yeah, just my thoughts, though, on this whole thing. I understand Adesanya's anger, but I also get Du Plessis. I don't think he meant to say those words, but My issue is more with people who are kind of choosing to ignore Adesanya's point of view and are actively talking about how Du Plessis is so innocent and he didn't do anything wrong. And yeah, what he said was fine. Just like I said, think about it a bit. What Du Plessis said may not have had bad will behind it, but sometimes this phrase doesn't really count here. But you know how they say, it's not about what you say, but how you say it. What Du Plessis wanted to say and what he actually said, I think, are two different things. I don't think he meant it in that way, but he ultimately essentially questioned, talking about when they went to New Zealand and America and talking about how he's going to be the African champion in the UFC. It's just not, it wasn't the greatest choice of words, but we'll see what happens. But just my thought on this whole Adesanya Du Plessis situation. They're going to fight, I think, in about 4 to 5 months, so it should be quite soon. But yeah, just my thoughts on the whole thing. I feel it's a good win from Du Plessis against Whittaker, and it should be a good fight. And yeah, until next time.